All right. It says that we are recording. So, welcome to the show that doesn't have a name. I'm your host, Panyo Basa, and I have with me two honored guests who you maybe have seen before on my show, although not together like this. Numa and Steve, or Stevens. And both of them are pagans. I'm the token Buddhist in this group. And we're going to talk on the nature of the gods, Deorum Deorum. And I suppose, considering I'm probably more orthodox from a Buddhist point of view, although certainly not entirely orthodox, I've definitely got a heretical streak in me. I should probably just give a brief synopsis of gods, the gods, small g gods, from a Buddhist point of view. And you may notice behind me I've got all kinds of nice pagan Yule stuff because Saturnalia and the feast day of Sol Invictus are coming up soon.
Yes.
And I'm drinking my Southern sweet tea from a pagan mug. So we're all set. Stevens, you look kind of like it's like a Christian motif or something, like you're in the belfry of a cathedral or something.
Yes. They're Moroccan lanterns.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
And
well, the
I have
Moroccans
bars
were
on the
pagans at
windows
one time.
because I have bars on the windows because I'm on a first floor in Manhattan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, those Manhattanites are notorious for breaking into people's houses. So anyway, as a Buddhist, from the Buddhist point of view, of course, there are lots of so-called heaven realms inhabited by what would be called small g gods. There are, in the Orthodox reckoning, there are 31 planes of existence, and all but the bottom 6 would be inhabited by small g gods. Although population-wise, probably there are more inhabitants of the lower 6 than all of the upper realms combined, just because it's so hard to get into these upper realms. And it's very easy to become an animal, for example. Just consider all of the plankton floating around out there that are technically members of the animal realm, copepods, for example. And so there are 3 main realms or lokas. I guess that would literally be like a world or a cosmos. So the lower realm, which we are inhabiting, is the sensual realm or the Kamaloka, and that contains all of not only the lower realms and the human realm, but the lower heavens, which would be in Pali or Sanskrit would be devas, and that goes all the way up to the realm of the devas who delight in the creations of others. Maybe I can go into a little more detail, and then you get into the Brahma realm, and the Brahma realm, they're more ethereal. They're a more subtle matter. A human could not see them unless they like deliberately made some sort of alteration to their appearance, like slowed down their vibrational rate or some such. They are always living in a state that, from a human point of view, would be jhana. They're like in a jhanic mental state. They don't have any male or female anymore, and they've got, strangely, it's like counterintuitively, they've got fewer sense organs or fewer sense bases. They only have like sight and hearing. They don't even have a sense of touch, supposedly, in what is called the Rupa Loka, or the world of form. This is like the Brahmas that still have a physical body, even though it's like a more subtle matter than our bodies are composed of. And then above that, you've got the Arupa Loka, or the formless realm, where the beings there are just pure mind. They don't have a physical body anymore. And some of them are in such, like, they're at such a subtle level that they're not thinking even. They're in like really advanced jhanic states, like the formless jhanas. I mean, they'd be in that kind of state. They'd just be like in a state of bliss that could be an approximation of like the bliss of enlightenment, but they're not enlightened. And sooner or later, they're going to exhaust their karma, because they're not really creating new karma when you get up into such a realm where you don't have a physical body and you're not thinking anything. That, after a zillion gajillion years or so, just rough estimate there, they exhaust their karma, and then they come back, and they leave that place and appear somewhere else, which indicates that there aren't any beings that are immortal in Buddhism. I assume that would be different in at least some, like classical paganism, they are referred to as the immortal gods. Whereas in Buddhism, although they live, they can live for millions or billions of years, nevertheless, they do die. They don't have old age. They just kind of, according to the commentaries, according to the commentaries, they just become less radiant, and then their friends realize that they are soon to pass away from this heaven realm, and they come around and make their goodbyes, maybe do a little blissful condolence. We're going again. There was a slight technical interruption there. So, as I was saying, the devas, or even the highest realms, from the Buddhist perspective, they don't live forever. They may live a very long time, and they don't have sickness or old age. I think the human level is about the highest level that still has illnesses and decrepitude associated with old age. And then once you get into the deva realms, they don't live forever, but when their karma is exhausted from all of their delighting in the delights of whatever heaven realm they're in, they begin to fade out, and then they disappear from there and appear somewhere else. And it's my understanding that only the lower heaven realms, just a few, like one or two heaven realms above the human level, they're still born of a womb. It's like a goddess or a female deva, a devi, will actually get pregnant. Otherwise, they just manifest. They just materialize in that realm, already fully formed. Like a youth, a young adult. So I guess, also I should say that they do have powers. They have like psychic powers. They can clairvoyance and clairaudience and that sort of thing. They can, some of them can change shape and so forth. And one last thing I will mention before I move on, or let you guys discuss the more Western paganistic descriptions of gods, and then we get into the like personal interpretations and so forth, is that the realm just above us, the realm of the four kings, it's called, there are terrestrial devas. So there are devas living on this earth among us, like tree devas and ground devas and sky devas and so forth. So I'll just pass on the baton to Numa, and I think you intend to give a more classical, like Greco-Roman kind of description.
Sure. Yeah, first I'll say there's actually a lot of similarity. There's differences and similarities between these two different views, especially when we take Neoplatonism into account. But first I want to say, so if we're to generalize all of what we'd call paganism, I'd say there's two main views. There's the what I call a theological view of the nature of the gods, and then there's what I call the ground up sort of folk view of the gods. And that's usually when cultures in their more, I don't want to use a primitive, but lesser developed, like tribal stage. Whatever word they use for the gods is a generalization of any kind of intelligent or powerful non-physical being. So the Greeks would have the term the theoi, would include the gods proper, also spirits and like nymphs and satyrs, and what you're actually referring to possibly being terrestrial devas in the Buddhist system. So it's sort of an all-encompassing category. A good analog to that is the native Japanese pagan tradition, Shinto. They use the word kami as a general term, just like theoi, that includes just all different kinds of classes of beings. So when you translate over to that to the gods, you're just talking about non-physical beings that have some degree of power and intelligence. So that's the basic view. But so when we get into more complicated models, what I call the theological view. So an example would be in Platonism starts breaking these beings down into very discrete categories, like hierarchical from higher to lower. So the more transpersonal, the more transpersonal gods are more like higher. and away from, further away from what you call more like human qualities that seems to be ascribed to the different classes of devas in the Buddhist system. So I mean, it took several centuries of development, but by the late antiquity, so like the 3rd and 4th century, we have this, after like Plotinus and Porphyry and these other thinkers, we have this fully fleshed out model. So they would consider like the highest gods, they use the term hypercosmic. And then below that, they use the term encosmic. So hypercosmic means beyond the cosmos. Encosmic is within the cosmos. And then below that are angels, and further below that are what they call daimons. This is a word that got semantically shifted over time into what Christians use the word demon to basically just denigrate any being that wasn't, exalted within the Christian cosmology. But a daimon just meant, in Greek, just means spirit. So there's no moral connotation. It could be a good spirit, a bad spirit, a neutral spirit, whatever. It's just kind of an all-encompassing term. Latin, the term genius would be the Latin equivalent of daimon. So that's a basic rundown. So you can call these kind of man-made classification systems for imagining the gods in different gradations. Now, what I think inspired the Neoplatonists to do this, the Neoplatonists had a very, let's say, ambivalent relationship with Greek, the way the gods were depicted in Greek philosophy, because they're, I mean, anyone who's read Greek myths sees a lot of unflattering things ascribed to the gods, and even Plato was pretty cranky about the poets. He considered them sort of blasphemers of what represents like true divine qualities.
I think it was really a problem for the Greeks, is they'd had all these really famous myths showing the gods as just glorified, messed up nobility, it seemed like.
Right. So yeah, they had to devise this whole system of argumentation, which from one perspective you can see it as kind of being cope. So we have all these myths we have to deal with that they're just like kind of really vulgar in the way they depict the gods. But now we have this more, spiritually refined worldview we're trying to, advance through these writings and dialogues and things like that. So they had a lot of Neoplatonic writings was coming up with various elaborate explanations explaining, well, why the gods really are not that, why they're really these higher manifestations of divinity. So that's a lot of that. So just to recap, to compare and contrast that with the more peasant view of things, the folk view, they weren't really into hair splitting. They just considered a god to be anything they interacted with, and it seemed to be more powerful than a person, than a human being.
So are the like in paganism, or like classical paganism, were the gods necessarily anthropomorphic? Like in Buddhism, all the gods that have a physical body look like humans.
Yeah, oh yeah, especially among the Greeks. The Greeks were really the ones who popularized in the Western Eurasia. The Greeks were the most anthropomorphic of all the pagan cultures, and then the Romans actually, surprisingly, before they came into contact with the Greeks, so back in their archaic stage, they did not anthropomorphize their deities at all. It was very abstract. They used the term noumena to refer to like anything in nature has a spiritual quality to it, and they called basically the plurality of spiritual quality they referred to as noumena, which is a plural for the word numen, N-U-M-E-N, which is just a word for the spiritual quality of a particular thing. So the Romans saw this even in the most mundane things, like the spirit, the field behind your house had a spirit, the woods had a spirit, the lake, the pond has a spirit to it. Even inside the house, like the hearth has a spirit, the doorway has a spirit to it. So that, noumena is like all those things kind of put together. And it wasn't really, it was very abstract and not anthropomorphized. And then, when they basically, the religion just merged into the Greek, when the Greeks started settling in Italy, they just basically ended up adopting the Greek religion, and then they start borrowing all the anthropomorphisms.
So
It
before
sounds
they,
like there's an animist kind of quality to some of that, the
Yeah,
earlier versions.
yeah, I
yeah,
was thinking that too. It just sort of like an evolutionary development of animism. It probably started as some kind of animism and then gradually, became more sophisticated,
that's
so to
right.
speak.
Yeah, very.
It's interesting, from what some of the scholars have told me, there was originally this concept of what they call the super body in pagan religions. That is to say, the god is able to cross or bridge the gap between the spiritual world and the physical world by taking on a body, which is like supra mundane, but still godlike in nature. And I know you see that in some of the anthropomorphisms from the Greco-Roman religion. But from what I'm told, in the earlier texts as well of Christendom, or not Christendom, of Judaism, the God himself originally has a kind of pagan super body, right? When Judaism is originally very primitive, more pagan in nature, you see certain texts which allude to this idea of the God having or taking on a kind of physical body, right? Where I think Moses at one point sees the backside of him, or sees God walking away from him, and things like that. And then as the development goes on into this linear historicization of their religion, the idea of God being able to incarnate in some sort of physical way, or even to create physical manifestations like appearing as a strange fire, things like that, those disappear as God becomes more and more distant from the world, and the immanence or the emanation of God is removed by Judaism, right? And you see that definitely in Islam as well. And I think in Christianity was in some sense maybe a kind of reemergence of that, where Christ in a way is kind of like a super body, except it has different characteristics of it, but it's a weird kind of merger of those kind of things.
Yeah, it seemed like the early Hebrews, or maybe the later Hebrews, were even experimenting with just not even having a name. I mean, he didn't have an appearance later on, or at least none that. Well, I mean, it's strange because, like in Christianity, you've got God sitting on the throne with the angels all around, falling on their face over and over again, saying "Holy, holy, holy" all the time. Although that could be even Christ or something. It was like, to some degree, you get the idea in early Christianity that Christ was sort of like the physical manifestation of God or some such.
Yeah, and Judaism, though, that was an old Near Eastern pagan trait where they would use epithets. They would hide the true name of their deities, so it was all epithets. Like you see throughout the Levant, the word Baal, which modern people believe to be some, because of Christianity, they believe to be some, just like an evil demon or something. But it's all it means is Lord. It's just a title and is applied to many different deities, and usually it was like a Baal of such and such place.
Yeah.
So
It's interesting also, you see in the very early Hebrew and Judaic texts these contests between the sorcerers of Yahweh and the sorcerers of Baal. And of course, in the Judaic text, they humiliate the sorcerers of Baal because the magic of Yahweh is more powerful. They're able to actually do things like, I guess, summon lightning or these other sort of magical acts, which indicate that the power of Yahweh is greater than the power of Baal, or that Baal in some way doesn't exist, but Yahweh does, even though they both are referring to, they are both two Semitic clans that are referring to basically a god that to us would be, two gods that to us would be indistinguishable, but I guess they are related in some way as being tribal sort of totems, or being tribal entities, representatives of those tribes and their power struggle between these sorcerers.
Yeah, that was common. These Middle Eastern tribes, they love to have pissing matches over pretty much anything. So logically, religion would be a part of that. But you could say Yahweh was just the Baal of Judah, and I think Edom. He was a god of Edom too. And so it was just like my Baal is bigger than your Baal, and then they'd have a war over it or something like that.
Yeah, there's a lot of that in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Before we move on to Stevens to give his synopsis, there's a couple questions that came up that I want to ask you before we go completely in a different direction. One was you referred to was it the Greeks, I think, referring to gods as non-physical. I assume they'd have some kind of body. Would it be like in like Buddhist cosmology, where they have like a subtle body that, you know, you can't be seen by humans, but they still have a body that's just at a more subtle, you know, vibration rate or something? Or are they really just pure mind?
Are you talking to me? Well,
I was asking Numa because he was saying that the gods were considered to be non-physical.
I would say they'd have a super body, right? That they could take on periodically, potentially, to interact with people. But I don't really, you know, it's not my area of expertise.
Yeah. So there's different views on this. There was a common belief that the power of a deity could reside within a physical object, like a statue. That was very common across different cultures. Now, did the average Greek believe the god had a physical body? Maybe. I'm not entirely sure. I think that the issue with this religion was there were so many different regional variations of the old, like what you call the old folk pagan religion. So that's not really a huge area of expertise on what these like individual like city states and regions believed. I'm more like learn on the Neoplatonic view of them, and Neoplatonists definitely didn't think the gods had like dense physical bodies.
So they didn't really think that Hephaestus was lame and walked with a limp, anything like that?
No, they were pretty cranky about those kind of beliefs. Those are just like corrupted folk beliefs that those evil poets were spinning.
Yeah. Okay, I got one more question. And you're talking about the hypercosmic gods. And that reminded me of, like, I think it's Plato's Symposium, where they're talking about Aphrodite, and they say that actually there are two Aphrodites. You know, you've got the more human Aphrodite, and then you've got the more cosmic, you know, the higher Aphrodite. You know, so the human Aphrodite would just be like human love, human beauty, or at least earthly, worldly love, worldly beauty, whereas the higher Aphrodite was just sort of love as I mean, the way I would interpret it is just sort of love as like a window to like the highest divinity, you know, just sort of like an aspect of the highest capital G God or some such. Although maybe the Greeks didn't think in those terms at first.
No, yeah, probably not at first. They believed every version of Aphrodite was just like a different personal entity. But yeah, so in the Platonic view, like the highest would be like a primordial cosmic power of everything pertaining to corresponds with love. Basically came from this power and then filtered on to like, you know, lower levels of this being, down to personal entities who embodied the characteristics of the highest Aphrodite. So that I guess would be the Platonic like view of how that worked. Or I'm going to find in Hinduism it's similar. They would like describe the highest forms as like different shaktas or powers of like the great divinity. So there'd be like a shakta for corresponding to love, one corresponding to war or conflict, or, you know, one to some other quality.
Yeah, in Hinduism, the gods can have different personalities. Like Parvati, the consort of Shiva, also manifests as Kali and Durga and a few others, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, they're big into that, syncretizing different names of divinities with like one greater divinity, and that is similar to what ended up happening in Platonism.
Yeah, well, I mean, just the Greeks and Romans, when they would conquer or colonize some new territory, they'd be worshiping some deity there. They would just pick the Greco-Roman one that most resembled the one that they were worshiping.
So they invade Gaul, and they're like, well, the Gauls all worship Mercury. Obviously, it was a different name to them. And so they set up a shrine, you know, to the Mercury of this place in Gaul. And so now all the Gauls are worshiping it under the Roman name. Yeah, that happened a lot. Another thing too is so when you're talking about terrestrial devas in the Indic or Buddhist view, that I think well corresponds with what we call like land spirits or demigods of places. And that was another way the Greeks especially would take the main name of the god and then add a place name onto it. often when they did that, they weren't actually talking about like a local, so some local lesser deity that happens to have a personality that corresponds with that main deity. So it's almost like a classification system. If it, like in the modern era, we use all these Latin terms for different species of plants and animals. So that you would use like a generic Latin term and then a more clarifying one below that to further get into what subdivision of species of this type of species that is. So I'd see it as being a similar like classification scheme with what the Greeks and Romans did.
Yeah, I assume the Neoplatonists had a really elaborate classification scheme.
Yeah, they did for the different layers of reality.
Those that weren't skeptics, I mean.
Yeah. Well, that fizzled out. That's actually the academic skeptics was right after Plato died. The Platonic Academy became a school of skepticism. A lot of people don't know this. And then about 2 centuries later, that fizzled out and it took a more mystical direction, which led to Middle Platonism, which was very mystical. And then Middle Platonism was the bridge directly to Neoplatonism.
All right. So, Stevens, you call yourself a
that was
pagan?
very interesting. Thank you for that. I don't know too much about the historical minutiae about that, but it's something that I'm very interested in. I think I'll add one thing also about the idea of this transition from paganism into Judeo-Christian beliefs as we know them today, right? In early Exodus and those types of writings, early versions of it, apparently, the priestly tent of meeting, which is the place in which Yahweh actually physically resides, was used by Moses and other people to actually prophesy or to have an encounter with God, bodily or physically, because he resided within this tent. In some way, it was like a portal, or that there was a force that the God was using to sort of, again, bridge the gap. And he had a physical residence in this ark, right, or this box, which was like the sanctum sanctorum. And you can imagine these people out in the desert with their tents erected with these poles, and they would be kind of like, I would imagine, like a Bedouin or something like that, like you would think of today, just completely out in the middle of nowhere. And there's this tent there that God actually, lives in. And that's a complete anathema, of course, to like Protestantism or something like that today, where a church is just a dead box, or anywhere that you go to worship. And that's a big difference, I think, between, a sort of culture which has a little bit of paganism there left and is in transition into this other thing, right? So anyway, my view is kind of trying to reconcile my own inherent, modern biases and beliefs with my own experiences with studying the esoteric and the occult, and also with philosophy, which I studied at the university on and off, along with religion. So it's kind of maybe an odd or eclectic blend, but I think of it as being pagan. I identify it as being pagan because I imagine it's similar to what some of the earlier pagans would have done, or the style in which they would have done it, or the spirit in which they would have done it, right? Which I think is a lot more important than dressing up or doing these kind of historical recreations where we discover these old texts or books and we try to go through line by line and kind of like recreate or do something like that and think that that's what it really was, right? Where it's much more spiritual in nature, I think. And I would resonate a lot with what you said about the Neoplatonists in terms of, I guess, the theological view or the gradations and the way that they use this system to sort of create these cosmic power forces, I guess, and to see through these laws of resonance, these hermetic kind of laws, and classify the way that these power forces are moving through or resonating through various categories in these tables of correspondences and things like that. I think that's that's interesting, and it's a good way to do it. I don't see them in their ultimate form as being discrete entities. They have overlap to them, but I think they ultimately come from, I guess you use the word hypercosmic, right? At the ultimate level, they're coming out of this, if you want to call it like a pleroma or unformed sort of thing which metaphysically exists necessarily in any possible universe. So when I think about the nature of the gods as I conceive it, I think about what is it that's metaphysically necessary first. When I'm thinking about the source of the gods, the hypercosmic gods, I think about what is it that couldn't not exist, right? What is it that has to exist in any kind of universe that we create? When we are children, for example, and we first become conscious, there is this, I think, first sort of most inherent idea in existence, which is the idea of separation that begins to occur psychologically between the self and the world. And from that, we instantiate the number one, and all of the other numbers come out of this sort of metaphysical moment of creation, the moment that the individual steps out of the pleroma, right, or out of this oneness or singularity. There is immediately an idea of separation. So there is the number one is instantiated. There is then an intercourse between the self and the things that one is separated from. That's then you have the number two, you have the intercourse between those things, the number three. All of these numbers come out of this existence necessarily. In order for existence to exist, those things have to sort of ideally be there. And so we can think maybe they exist prior to consciousness. Maybe they have an existence which precedes us and which is more real in some way than our own reality, which is the sense that Plato talks about it, I guess, is sort of more perfect, right? Now, once those numbers come into being, there are certain properties of them which begin to occur, right? The properties of increase and decrease, for example, these ideas that all of the rest of the Hermetic maxims are formed from come out of these ideas. And from there, I think you can categorize things like the idea of increase, right? When the numbers begin to add up or pile up, accumulation. Now you've got a Jupiterian vibe, or you have an opposition, right? You have laws of polarity. If there's an opposition there, you have a Martian vibe. You have these various different kinds of more discrete ideas that begin to form that we can look at and categorize. And we can say at the hypercosmic level, these ideas have to exist necessarily in order for there to be any kind of existence at all. There can't really, if we think about it, at least deductively, it doesn't seem like there can be any kind of existence without these first metaphysical principles. And those principles resonate through our reality on many different levels. And whether or not they have intelligences, I mean, the occultists certainly believe that there are many, an infinity of different spirits, which again, they don't necessarily have discrete beings automatically, but they can form out of this pleroma and resonate with that hypercosmic principle from which they stem. And so they can take on intelligences which can actually be communicated with. And somebody like Jung would say, well, these are fragments or complexes in the collective unconscious which are able to speak to you. They could be racial in nature. They could be familial in nature, right? And we have ideas of family curses, for example, or eccentricities, or racial ideas, right? I think last time I mentioned Jung riding through the fields somewhere in Europe on a train and seeing the fields filled with blood. And he says the Germanic ancestry of
Wotan archetype
is coming back. Yeah, is surfacing. And so these different things can surface and they can take on an intelligence in much the same way maybe that we as human beings, can coalesce, take on an intelligence for a time and then disperse again. So and then basically what someone does who is an occultist, probably in the truest sense, is to either invoke or evoke those intelligences in such a way that they can become useful, they can glean information or knowledge which would be forbidden or unknown to him or her, or to use those intelligences or spirits or demons to attack or to do various sorcerous actions with, right? Or to perform, that's just sorcery, but there's also, theurgy, to use these higher Olympic spirits and so on to gain knowledge that allows one to further one's own spiritual path, but one's own anamnesis, one's remembrance, one's purification of the soul, but that does not strictly benefit one in the world, right? But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what you were saying earlier, it reminds me of Hegel. Starting with the first principle, the beginning of his logic or whatever, just pure being, and then he uses, of course, the dialectic with the antithesis being non-being, and how being and non-being, pure being and pure non-being just merge together, and they really are indistinguishable. So then you have to have the like the contrast. I can't remember the German word, like Desein or something. You have to have like a contrast between being and non-being, and then he just works out this whole elaborate system, including the whole history of the earth, culminating in German culture of the early 19th century or something as the culmination of all this. But yeah, that's pretty much how I go about my understanding of the gods also. So I'm really a heretic from a Buddhist point of view. I certainly don't believe that any god with a body is necessarily going to be anthropomorphic, is going to look like a human being. Probably most gods have nothing to do with human beings, I assume. I mean, theoretically, you could have gods with tentacles or gods that are like geometric patterns. One other thing that you said is that about gods, being possibly at a higher level of reality than us. I think that would almost be part of the definition of a god, as opposed to like a demon or a ghost or something. From the Buddhist point of view, obviously they're at a higher, more subtle level of reality than us.
From an occult perspective, these things definitely exist, and these realms definitely exist as well. And many of the things that we can conceive of do exist. If they're metaphysically possible, then probably they do exist. Is there a way to contact them? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends. But you can certainly make contact with these spirits as to what they are, where they're coming from. Their provenance is going to probably be unknown to us just by the nature of our being.
If I can cut in for a second. First of all, Stevens, I want to say that was a glorious stream of consciousness.
Thank you.
And to me, that whole thing sort of takes a flamethrower to the materialist worldview. There's just a lot of stuff. There was probably 10 hours of video content packed into, further elaborating on all the things you brought up. That was pretty great. If I could take it back to the first part you started on, the Yahweh and the tent example. First, I might insult, I don't know if those people would necessarily be watching this, but my theory that Yahweh was originally just a minor, land spirit, or what you call a terrestrial deva, specific to like a very small area of land. So secondly, that phenomena of a god manifesting in a small physical enclosure, you can open a modern day Shinto manual and it explains how this entire thing works, how you use a physical space to contain the essence of, whether you want to call it a spirit or an angel or a god. That's definitely explained in there. Again, a whole other video would be on the metaphysical mission creep of how Yahweh ascended from being a minor land spirit up to the creator of everything. That's
he was like
story.
Lord of Hosts. I mean, which indicates maybe he was a war god at some intermediate level.
Yeah,
I
think
think slated with El, of course.
Yeah. El was the sky father of the whole Levant. That was El. El is also a generic term for a deity, But the proper, the All-Father God, El Elyon, I think was the title. But he was like the big god. The Greeks, I think, equated him with Saturn or Kronos. But yeah, so the Hebrews, when they, their theology got more elaborate, they would just assimilated the big god into their little god, and then he became the big god. And then I think they just gradually started assigning the attributes of deities from all their neighbors into their god. So he just became like the god of everything to them eventually at some point.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting. I know so much of this stuff comes from the early Mesopotamian myths as well, right? Like Atrahasis and the story of Marduk, and the story of the Judaic kingdom, I suppose, can also be seen from an occult point of view as the rise of this relatively obscure familial deity as it accumulates power in the noosphere, in this thought realm. This egregore is growing stronger and stronger, and is beginning to mimetically resonate in the minds of other people as he sort of becomes like all things to all men, right? And I would associate it maybe with, sort of like a fertility, originally probably more of a fertility god, then becomes more like a Jupiter kind of figure, or a warlike sort of figure.
I think the Romans usually associated him with Jupiter. Actually, when Hadrian, after the last of the 3 Jewish revolts, Hadrian basically destroyed the temple and the entire Temple Mount, and erected a giant temple. He basically rebranded Yahweh as just a local Jupiter. And I think the name was Jupiter Capitolina, was the name that Hadrian gave to the Romanized Yahweh, and built a huge temple to him up on the hill.
Yeah, I think Antiochus Epiphanes attempted that also with unpleasant results.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other story and a half there. Anyway, but yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic to go on many tangents about.
Well, Stevens, you were talking about, the thing that reminded me of Hegel when you were talking about, there is like this pleroma, you called it, or like Hegel's pure being at the very beginning of his logic, or just ultimate reality, or like primordial chaos. You got this infinitude of potential that is underlying everything. And in Buddhism, there's like the stability that creates like a stable, more or less predictable world would be dependent core rising, or paticca samuppada. It sort of creates a kind of stability in the midst of the chaos, or the pleroma, or whatever. And if we live in an infinite universe with infinite potential, supposedly, then anything that possibly can exist does exist, and there's just an infinitude of beings, including an infinitude of beings that are more advanced than we are, that would be called gods.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think also
so that's my understanding. Also, it's I really cannot accept the Buddhist idea of everything is, they have to be according to this classification, and they're all anthropomorphic up until you get to the non-physical ones and so forth. It's I have to embrace heresy on that one.
Yeah, well, I think part of what you're saying there also with this idea of these saying, anything that can exist does somewhere, right? There are still certain things which are metaphysically impossible, and so you have to ask the question, well, why? Why are there certain things that are metaphysically impossible? Why is there just not seemingly total chaos? And so I look at that as there being some sort of at least basic natural laws of things. Again, laws, these are like the Hermetic laws, right? Laws of resonance, laws of attraction, repulsion, and so on. And so I look at some of the activity of the gods as being the framework of that, right? The framework of what is metaphysically possible or impossible. And that, if you really think about it, it's quite mind-blowing, because it implies that there is something eternal which has its own existence regardless of our own sort of petty, day-to-day life, or regardless of our ideas about postmodernity, and we can see anything from any different perspective, and that there isn't anything that's eternal. Things just sort of pop into existence when we measure them, and all this kind of stuff. And maybe some of that is true, but ultimately they still do seem to resonate to some of these natural laws, right? I was quite shocked to discover this myself, because I was very, very much sort of a product of materialism and postmodernity and these types of things. So when I went into the study of philosophy, it was really just with the mind to sort of mock these kinds of ideas of anything being eternal or anything like that. I still have a problem with some of it, the idea of telos or teleology, the idea by Hegel, for example, that everything has this purpose that it's moving towards. But because I think, as somebody who identifies more as pagan, I see this idea of movement towards one final goal as being kind of like a childish or human kind of desire, right? I see things
the
as
goal,
consistently
the
moving.
goal is pre-existent. It's like, everything is already there simultaneously, in a sense. So it's like, that's one thing I couldn't really accept from like Christianity, like Teilhard de Chardin or something, who was saying, that God is like evolving and he created the world in order to sort of fulfill himself or some such. And if you start off with infinity, and then just some of the little aspects of infinity just become they become like recursive, self-referential, and start thinking that they're a discrete entity separate from everything else, which is our situation, it seems to me. We're just an aspect of infinity that has developed sort of a self-consciousness that considered that this kind of it ignores the infinity part. It's just we become limited just because there's like this possibility of a limited consciousness contained within the total consciousness, if that makes any sense. And there's just an infinite number of that. Anything that possibly can emerge from chaos, which is just infinite potential, is going to do so.
Yeah, and that's one reason why I like some of the Platonic ideas about existence or about the soul, and that there is this process of remembering and forgetting, which is consistently going on, which is framing this play of existence, if you want to call it Leela or whatever. There's a play, there's this ongoing sort of framework that I like Nietzsche's ideas about tragedy as being a very pagan thing rather than romance, which I would associate more with this idea of a God which is totally separate from the world, which transcends and is completely apart from it, and that the world that we live in is just basically just a giant toilet, right, for divinity. He just doesn't care about it. There's nothing special or interesting about it. I like this idea that there is some sort of meaning that we can derive from it, from tragedy, as opposed to just romanticizing about a separate kind of God who is out there. Nietzsche's idea is that tragedy is this very important aspect of all of our lives, and the gods are also playing out these kinds of tragedies, these tragic plays consistently. These themes that are archetypal are eternal, and they do transcend the world in the sense that they are the primordial times, the first times in illo tempore or illud tempus, as Mircea Eliade talks about, right? But they also permeate and create the framework for our world and our lives. And as we've removed the tragic element from our lives, we've lost beauty and aesthetics and meaning that was formerly sort of the purpose of our lives to seek out. And we become more obsessed with romanticism and the escape from the world and into a world of the imaginary. And as we've done that, we've cheapened our own existence. We've denigrated the dignity of humanity. We've atomized each other from friendships and from family structures and tribal structures and any relationships that we've had. And we've destroyed the relationships of the sexes between them both. And we've of cut ourselves off from our soul, right? And the way that we would project and see those aspects of the gods inside of ourselves outward in the world have been completely severed. And now we just see meaningless meat puppet people walking around engaged in this silly and purposeless, act of, killing each other and then melting into the ground. And that's basically it, right? So I would submit to everybody that this worldview is much more fulfilling and meaningful than the other one, right? And even regardless of its epistemic status, if we can know if it's true, if it's ontologically true, whatever, as Nietzsche would say, what's so great about the truth anyway, if it just results in what we're seeing in this, right? But I think it probably is true, and it is much more true and much more philosophically defensible than materialism, which is completely indefensible at this point, I think.
Yeah, definitely agree. We could see too is when you're mentioning the total draining of immanence out of any kind of spiritual worldview, that started with the Abrahamic worldview. So you're talking about the world just becomes a toilet because there's no numinous quality in anything like physical or manifest anymore. It's just this distant concept of divinity, and that directly led into the awful materialist situation we're stuck in today. And you're mentioning too, even just recognizing the gods and their functions, you can start to inject sacral qualities back into any kind of mundane activity or just thing in your environment, and that you're literally just starting to make everything sacred again by just recognizing those qualities.
I think this idea about the numinous being completely separate from the world is tragic in a lot of ways, and people don't realize how close it is right there. Even people who are Orthodox Christians, these qualities are sort of reserved in many ways for the saints, right? Or just for some very old men at a time when God was still speaking to people and so on. But these qualities of the numinous are still there, they're still present, and they're still sort of waiting in the background. And I think a lot of what we're seeing through the internet, especially, and through modern events, all of these things which were in some way made to destroy this part of the human being actually has paradoxically been used or is being used now as an engine to sort of refuel these old gods and egregores and concepts which are bubbling up now more and more from the subconscious. I like this idea of the psychic weather. I watch Thomas Sheridan sometimes, who's this Irish pagan folklore guy, and he talks about this idea of the psychic weather, and Jung says that there's this large portion of people that are predisposed to becoming ideologically possessed because they have no integrated persona. They haven't integrated these different parts of themselves, and so these other parts that are parts of the collective are liable to come up out and grab them, and they become basically just these tools for these demonic entities potentially, right? And the internet fuels that as well. So the technology is a tool in some way for these entities to come through and to manifest themselves, more and more into being. So it's been kind of a double-edged sword, but I think the internet in a lot of ways is responsible for this proliferation of people into things like what I'm talking about, or also certainly, if not this, then a lot of new age ideas have become very prevalent because the internet has also, and technology has displaced organized religion really heavily. And so people are looking for some kind of meaning in their lives, and they're going towards these cults, and they're going towards online virtual worlds, and they're trying to find meaning in that, right? But it's much more meaningful if you are able to actually find the numinous qualities in your own life in pretty much every instant. There is an archetype or a tragedy or a framework for everything that's going on constantly. And if you can find that, then you can derive meaning, for yourself.
It takes a very strong mind or a very simple, stable mind to do that, I think, because it's one reason why we're living in a materialistic worldview right now is the numinous is scary. I mean, chaos, the frontier between the predictable and just the unknown, the invisible forces and all that is scary. People have always been afraid of it. You can't completely close it off, but modern Western civilization has done more to close it off than anything else. Maybe Marxism has gone even farther than the scientific materialists of like the Anglosphere, where you're just creating, in a way, you're creating rules. It may be that subatomic particles just did not exist until, some scientist, discovers it. And then it's like, it becomes part of this structure that is making everything understandable and predictable and more or less safe in a way. But I mean, in order to be alive, in order not to just be robots, you have to have some of the chaos kind of bleeding through. And I mean, the more they build this wall around us of scientific laws and so forth, it's just creating this pressure, and I don't think it's sustainable. Sooner or later, there's going to have to be a flowing the other way of sort of opening the floodgates a little bit and letting the numinous or the sort of the chaotic or the mysterious paranormal elements back in again.
Well, we're starting to see this already. The beginning of this is mass numbers of people in the West are starting to doubt the infallible word of experts. I think this is the floodgates opening, because for the longest time, at least the past 60 or 70 years, you had this basically technocratic managerial class of experts. Anything they say is gospel. And before the woke stuff, it was mostly in the form of scientific materialist dogma, and it was just believed no matter what. And now we're seeing people actually turning away from this because of, the series of clown world events that we're all familiar with. And so some people are starting to scratch their heads and be like, wait a minute, maybe science doesn't have the answers to everything. Maybe scientists are corrupt. Maybe trying to quantify everything and take quality out is maybe not such a good idea. So I'm very curious to see where this is going to lead.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be a return to any kind of archaic paganism. It's going to have to be some new Neoplatonism or some such, because I mean, we just can't go back to the sort of worn out tropes of Jupiter, and I mean, unless they're just redefined in a way that a modern or postmodern person can accept.
Right. It's going to have to be some Hegelian thesis between what we're coming out of, and what it was opposed to, and then something that sort of triangulates those.
But you are a practicing pagan, are you not, Numa?
Yeah.
So what does that constitute, to the extent that you are willing to divulge it?
Well, I don't like to go too much into personal. Some people don't like to go too much into personal spiritual experiences, because really it's something that's subjective at the end of the day. We've had about over 2,000 years of people running around trying to convince everybody else that their subjective spiritual experiences should be everybody else's spiritual reality. But no, having said that, yeah, I've definitely had interesting, weird, and good experiences with that kind of, invoking deities, I guess you could say. And I could just say, I don't expect anyone else to believe this, but I'm convinced that they are real entities and that they're intelligent and powerful. Now, what they are, wherever the place each of these entities are in the grand, the grand chain of being, I don't know. I also reckon I have a skepticism streak to me where I realize that the human intellect is very limited, and a lot of these categorization schemes to me just seems kind of, I guess, playing little ego games and pretending that we have everything mapped out, when, as you were alluding to, the cosmos is practically limitless, and there's probably just an almost infinity number of gods and spirits and other entities out there, and there are things that we can't imagine them to be at all, weird shapes and forms that would probably horrify us if we saw it in the true form, Yeah,
or five-dimensional beings or some such.
Yeah, things weirder than a geometric, 50 tentacled stellar vampire squid, or so I don't know what. You get as weird as you want, but I'd also venture that a lot of these entities don't necessarily like care about human beings, or human beings are just not within their realm of concern. And
yeah,
the ones, yeah, there are a handful of ones I'd say that we, regularly interact with that do care about us to some extent. Not to like, not to be either like fortune or favor dispensers or helicopter parents. That's another thing that Abrahamic religion is that's another bad attitude. I think it's sort of foisted on us, but rather just helpful, maybe a helpful mentor, to put it very lightly, that do let us fail on our own merits. To invoke the old kind of Protestant aphorism, God helps those who help themselves. You can just make that plural and say the gods help those who help themselves. So yeah, there's just so many different types of experience out there. What I love about what I do, combining paganism and occultism, is that you leave kind of the understanding wide open to just almost infinite possibilities of what the gods and spirits are and how they manifest, and what their concerns are.
I've had this idea that assuming that there are small g gods that are interested in us, I assume quite a few of them would have been human in a previous life, and they they were what's the word, exalted, or they moved on, but nevertheless they have a certain like nostalgia or something for Earth and human civilization, and take an interest in it perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's definitely plausible. Now, the Greeks would have called those heroes, but see, that's another kind of hardened classification that I can go either way on. But yeah, I do think entities we interact with may have been human at some point.
Yeah, or similar to humans.
Similar,
maybe.
yeah.
Yeah.
Similar, and yeah, I mean, it leads to a view I have that I know the Indian religions don't really embrace this very much, but that what you can call like soul evolution itself is kind of linear and progressive. That you basically, whatever you want to call it, the soul. I like to call it the soul complex rather than just like a singular idea of a soul that gradually evolves up from a very simple organism and just gradually reincarnates into something more more intelligent and more complex over, if we can even use the word time. That's another thing to explore. I know I don't think in Buddhism is kind of like you can, you might evolve, you might reincarnate in a higher form, and then you'll fall into a lower one, and there's not really like a direct linear teleology to it.
Yeah. Also in Buddhism, I mean, in Hinduism, it seems like you're progressing, necessarily into more subtle and exalted forms until you get to the highest or the absolute. Right. Whereas in Buddhism, it's just sooner or later, you just bail out sideways, regardless of where you are on the scale. That it's just you can keep going up and down, or get higher and higher and higher, until you realize that there is no end to it. It's still all samsara, it's still all conditioned and worldly and so forth. And then you just kind of let go of the whole thing and bail out sideways, so to speak.
So this thing I think is really important in modern life also, that I should add in here at this point. Existentially speaking, this was this big battle, right, between these sort of forces in the Germanic metaphysical mind, I guess, of what Nietzsche would call like cultural exhaustion. And he would associate, I think, some of these aspects of Buddhism, although he was very much in many ways a Buddhist, but he was more pagan in the sense that he thought this idea of reincarnating forever and desiring to get out of the cycle, right, as being a symptom of one's own sort of existential angst. And so he thought that's where the Romanticism comes from. And he felt this idea of tragedy in this cycle, sort of like Wagnerian cycle of tragedy, was dramatic, right? And he used what one of my teachers called it the existential categorical imperative, which is that famous line from The Gay Science, I believe, where he says, what if a demon came to you in your worst nightmares and said you would have to live this life over and over again for eternity? would there be something sort of so epic and transcendental in that life, just one moment, that one would exalt and say, yes, I'll do it. I'll just keep reincarnating, right? Because he felt like without that powerful sort of pagan triumph through tragedy, that there would ultimately become this existential exhaustion in society that would seek that desire to sort of die permanently or to escape from this cycle of reincarnation. And I think that's ultimately like this very, very big defining split between paganism and Buddhism, in at least paganism as the sort of some of these German metaphysicians experience it, right? Where Schopenhauer goes on the other side, and Schopenhauer says, I'm very exhausted with life and I really want to die. And life really ultimately was not worth living. And it is better to have never been born at all, better to have never come into samsara. And then you have, on the other hand, there was a guy named Lev Shestov, who was a Jewish existentialist, Nietzschean, who says, better under any circumstances to come out of the realm of the womb of the one, even if it's just to endure some sort of horrible torture, one experiences. And so he says, well, better still to have been than to not have been. And I feel like that is a very, very like pagan mentality.
Yeah,
right?
Mahayanist or a Hindu would say that the separation from the one is all illusory anyway. It's Maya, and you're essentially just trying to realize the truth. I mean, waking up or like merging with the one is just a matter of realizing ultimate reality, that you never were separated to begin with. And I would also point out that it seems to me, of all the polytheistic religious systems or pagan systems, it's like Indian Hinduism is really the success story. As far as I'm concerned, it's the
Still
one that
here.
Yeah, it's still here. I mean, you've got Shinto in Japan, but it seems to me that the Japanese really don't take it very seriously. It's just kind of a formality, just a cultural formality that they do.
Much of it was reconstructed during the Meiji Restoration. So what really happened to Shinto was, over the course of like 1,000 years, it got so blended and merged with Buddhism that a lot of the original Shinto was just not there in a pure form. So during the Meiji Restoration, a bunch of court intellectuals started a project where they basically reconstructed it. So it's not too different than like people today trying to reconstruct the Norse religion or the Hellenic Greco-Roman religion or something like that. Though they had, lucky enough, being Japan, it was just a continuous isolated culture. So they had all the cultural elements there to work with. So it was a bit easier than those cases, but yeah.
Yeah,
I really
so I think
Yukio Mishima, and I resonate with some of the stuff that he did in the 50s, where he was talking about trying to bring some sort of tradition back to Japan after the World War II loss. And he does it through these ideas of martial sort of discipline. And he says, the Japanese people need something to die for. They need this meaning in their lives, which is martial, and which I think in many ways for him was pagan, and he was very influenced by these ideas of tragedy in his own sort of in his own life, because the Japanese life, he said, had become so sort of dead end and mundane and materialistic after World War II. And I think if you look at it today, I mean, he was dead on. That place is like the pinnacle of social engineering, right? Where everything that's going to happen here, happens there first. It's like a testing ground, and now you have this complete just obliteration of the differences between the sexes and people living in these cubicles where they're just plugged in all day to this
like a coffin with a TV at the foot of it.
Mundane virtual reality that's just so pathetically sad that you just don't know what to do. But they completely sort of obliterated any kind of national or racial or spiritual soul there, and it's sad to see. But he was hoping through his own sacrifice of himself, of his own body, his own ritual suicide publicly, that he would be able to arouse some sort of uprising, he was particularly upset about the idea that this declaration that the emperor was not a god. There was a public declaration that the emperor was not a god, and the emperor, I think, himself admitted that or said that, and he said, well, this guy is not the real emperor anyway. He's weak, and look at him. You know, the real emperor is a god, is an ideal, a transcendental or formal ideal somewhere. You know, and that's something that we can fight for. That's something that we can die for. So I thought that was interesting. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah. So again, the Hindus seem to have done the best job. Where I mean, they really take it seriously. I've been to India, and yeah,
there's
you've
2
got
billion of them too, right?
What's that?
There's what, 2 billion of them as well, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
more than a billion by now, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
props to, especially in southern India, it was they did a really great job preserving the tradition there. A lot of northern India was overrun by Muslims for over like 800 years.
Yeah, although I have been told that up around like the foothills of the Himalayas, like where would it be? Just like the headwaters of the Ganges area is still relatively, I mean, relatively speaking, it's still pristine to some degree.
That makes sense. I think that the Trans-Himalaya region is probably the most sacred place on Earth.
Yeah. And they take it very seriously, and I mean, they don't go so far as like some of the vulgar Romans, you know, who believe, you know, there's a god of sneezing and a god of sleep and a god of dreams and a god of marriage and a god of this and a god of that. You know, it's pretty much along the lines of Buddhism, where you have a few gods that may have some sort of, you know, like Mara, for example. He's like the official, you know, head villain of the superhuman beings, so to speak. But that's just kind of a position, and it's not one god. I mean, one god finally he exhausts his karma, and then another one takes his place. You know, it's just sort of a karmic role in the cosmos. You know, it's just part of the system. But yeah, so they have. I mean, there are gods that have certain qualities. You know, maybe some are more wrathful or dangerous, or you know, some are more peaceful or compassionate and helpful and so forth. But yeah, mainly it's the gods are just doing their own thing. You know, they're just you know, we're like, you know, animals in their backyard or some such, which is understandable. I mean, that's an acceptable way of looking at it. And again, I'm pretty sure the Hindus do not believe the gods are immortal, except for maybe, I don't know, I'm not 100% sure about this. Maybe like Shiva and Vishnu, you know, some of the like the ones that are manifestations of the ultimate may in a sense be immortal. But
yeah, that's it seems like a peculiar to the Greco-Roman system where they were immortal. A lot of other pagan, like the Norse, they did not believe their gods were immortal. They actually believed their gods were subject to fate and destiny like any other being.
Yeah, even the Greco-Romans believed that a god could be killed, but then he gets reborn again. You know, like
right.
Yeah, there's a few of them like that. Dionysius, I think, was killed and was reborn when he was like a baby or some such. Yeah, I'm not sure about the details.
Yeah, we'll look at the cycle of Ragnarok, right, or the ring cycle, the Wagnerian myths, and this sort of thing. These gods are destined to die again, and then a new cycle of gods will come about, right? But I think they still ultimately will resonate with those same kind of power forces that are inherent in the cosmos, even if they are different gods or they have different intelligences and so on, right? This is one thing that it's important for people to understand, I think, especially modern people. The spiritual world is not a benign place. It is very much like nature. And the spirit, denizens, the denizens that embody these different spiritual places and spiritual qualities are still subject to the same laws of nature that we are, just in different ways. And the spiritual world can be a predatory place, a place of great danger and great peril, great evil forces, parasitic forces that are seeking to prolong their own and perpetuate their own existence through the creation of suffering, the suffering of human beings in many cases. and the suffering of human beings that imbalances or displaces the human body, the human energy field, will attract these entities. And these things can cause psychosis or various physical or other mental diseases, basically. So people need to understand that it's not like it's portrayed in the New Age religion.
Right.
Dark sorcerers have been working in these realms in indigenous societies for a long time, and the shaman can heal people or come into contact with these entities to prophesy or find out who stole the chicken or whatever. But there are dark sorcerers as well who can kill, whose goal is to cause suffering to increase their power, or the power of the spirits that possess them, that are seeking to break through and to infiltrate the world. And so in that way, the spiritual world resonates very much with the laws of nature, right? The laws of resonance and correspondence and increase and decrease. And if you want to communicate with any of these forces, you have to have a vessel which is strong enough to contain those power forces. Otherwise, you'll be blown apart. Your psyche will be disintegrated by those forces. They've speculated, some people speculate that's actually what happened to Nietzsche, because by the end of his life, he was signing his name Christ or Dionysus and these types of things. And so it was speculated that maybe actually the power force, the Dionysian power force, ultimately tore his psyche apart, because it was so much bigger than the archetype is so much bigger than the human mind can contain. And he pushed himself so hard to find that and to channel that he ultimately did become, in some way, he did become a god while he was still alive. And it just simply broke his human mind.
Yeah, it is expected that you'd have the full spectrum. If it's emanating from, infinite possibilities, it's like
right.
The universe contains every possibility. There's going to be really dangerous ones out there also, in addition to the benevolent, the gods who smile upon us.
Yeah, no, that's a great points in there. It points to the idea that what a god sees as good is not necessarily going to be what a human sees as good or evil or whatever like that. And so on the lower levels of gods too, when we get into what you call terrestrial devas, or I call nature spirits, nature demigods, from what I know, everything I studied, they're there for a specific role. These are the basically the maintainers of the ecosystem and the biosphere. So a lot of the things, their functions they do, don't necessarily coincide with like comfort and prosperity and wealth for human beings, especially those that might live close to their domain. So if you're a stupid person and you come in doing something that's disruptive to their activity, they just might kill you or do something, something not very nice.
Yeah, like somebody dealing with an anthill in their backyard.
Right, exactly. They might open a can of whoop ass on you and your entire family, or make your whole like homestead like a place of horrors and misery and haunted, or something like that. This is why this is something universal to pagan cultures the world over. When you move to any new piece of land, the first preoccupation was appeasing the spirits of the land there, making the appropriate sacrifices, keeping them at least at bay, if not happy or content. And so yeah, you get these spirits that have a function. Then you just get a lot of grubby, like just bad spirits. Maybe they're nature spirits that got fired from their job of ecosystem maintenance, so they just wander around tormenting other beings. So I'm really just speculating and spitballing just possibilities here right now. But they're ones you do not want to have to deal with. And it just leads into what the point you were getting at, Stevens, is that the whole New Age idea about, the spirit world, I'm going to like just astrally travel and get in touch. The spirits are all like my friends and want to help me and realize my inner potential. Yeah, that's all crap. Also, the idea of blindly worshiping nature, that's a pitfall that many like people call themselves pagans today get into. If you get into the actual historical pagan cultures, they were like ambivalent at best about nature. They realized that it was indeed full of these perils and horrors, among good things too. But so you had to use these ritual and cultic practices as a way of staving off the dangerous aspects of these spiritual forces. So I think that's just a great point.
People have to realize, yes, they have to propitiate these forces because they still follow these hermetic maxims that are natural of exchange. These beings, gods, devas, whatever they are, still function off of energy. And so there is a reciprocity and a trade which has to be done there. And if they're interacting with us in that way, it's because they are existing in some sort of codependent relationship with us in the same way that an animal, a creature would, in nature, regardless of its intelligence level or not, whether it's sentient or not, it wants to stay together. Spinoza calls it conatus. All of these things are bound by its natural law to preserve and maintain the form that it has, right? Otherwise, it succumbs to entropy and it scatters apart. And so it will use the energies that it can generate from the human being, whether it's through trickery, through agitating some sort of weakness or energy in the body, in the energy body, in the field that attracts it in the first place, like blood in the water, right?
Yeah, blood.
Yeah, I've had this idea that I had a trumpet player, a jazz musician, once tell me that in order to become a famous musician in America or in the West, there are these cults where you're like, propitiating some, I don't even remember the name of the Baphomet or something like that. And I had this idea that it could be sort of almost like a colonial organism where it's like this spirit that just kind of absorbs its followers. They all become sort of like more than just a tribe, but like this colonial organism. This an organism that's kind of scattered physically, but it's like this energy is all just going in to feed this thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's absolutely correct, and that's absolutely what my view is, and that's absolutely what the occult view of it is. That's what sorcerers believe is actually occurring. Thomas Sheridan, again, to bring him up, he talks about this idea as the psychic weather, because the vulnerable individuals who have disintegrated pieces or parts of the persona are rupturing energy. When there is a hole in or disruption in the flow of the auric body, the vibration in the being begins to leak out, to rupture, to entropy, because the human being is created, is meant to function at a certain frequency, and dis-ease causes this disruption in the auric body. And that weakness is a signal to other beings. It lights you up like a lamp, right? And then once these things can see you, they begin to become attracted to that, and eventually they latch on. And if you are very weak, or you're not integrated, you have some very severe problems, more severe illnesses and addictions and things like that, then you're predisposed to possession. And these group-minded mentality movements, especially political movements that seem to result in mass madness, are the result of possession by an entity that is reaching its tentacles out through all of these different people and turning them into basically mindless clones for its agenda, for its army on Earth, to allow it to break through, to harvest energy, to create more and more suffering and more and more heightened emotional states in these disrupted energy bodies.
So, yeah. Stevens, you've told me that you have had experiences that to you were proof that the gods exist.
Well, I don't know if, did I say proof? I don't know.
Something along those lines, some facsimile of gods exist anyway.
Yeah, I don't know if it proves it to me, but I've definitely had strange experiences and feelings. I'm sure they could easily be explained away by materialists or a psychologist, but in a Jungian sense, I've definitely had experiences of what you might call the anima or things like that, right? This is this idea of encountering maybe a part of the soul, or encountering a feminine presence around you. I've had this particularly at certain times, although I'm afraid she may have left me at this point, but certainly earlier in my life, here and there, I've heard people talk about this sort of thing. There's a famous religious scholar, Jeffrey Kripal, who talks about experiencing an encounter with Kali, or with a sort of female entity, when he was in a somnambulant state in India during the Kumbh Mela. But for me, I can't pinpoint what causes it. It seems to be almost arbitrary, but there is a feeling that I have of an intense feeling of a strong sort of feminine presence that will come, and it can be vaguely sexual. It's not outrightly sexual. It's more of like that's an epiphenomenon of this presence being around, but it's a powerful presence, a sort of nurturing presence, and it gives me the feeling of like wanting to do something epic, wanting to strive for something great, right? Maybe it's like a Valkyrie or a goddess of some sort, and she wants you to die for her, or to do something to dramatically like pour your libido into her, to sacrifice that to her. And so again, that could be, who knows what that is, could even be a predatory kind of thing.
Succubus.
But I think it's probably it's more like an archetypal kind of thing rather than a succubus. I think I've probably had experiences with that as well, but that's more of a sleep related thing. This will happen. Just like I say, I don't know what causes it, but I had it quite a bit when I was down in Florida, living alone in this apartment. I would feel this kind of presence. I had it a lot also when I was in my late teens. So I'm not sure if it has something to do. I think it has something to do with the male libido, right? And the energy therein can attract these things, maybe, or maybe it is, as Jung, I think, would say, this is like an encounter with the anima, or with this. The soul of a man is feminine, as Jung in a Jungian sense, and so this is the converse part of oneself, the flip side that one is relating to. Right, but that's just in a Jungian sense. But it is actually, I think he would say, it is literally a goddess, right? If you could get him and pin him in a corner and force him to give you an answer, he would say, yeah, it is actually real. It is actually a spirit or a goddess, something like that.
It wouldn't hurt just asking if she wants to share her name with you, assuming this is like a real spirit, and then something might just pop into your head weirdly. Mm-hmm. I've heard. I can't vouch for this myself. I've just heard it from other practicing people.
Maybe I'll try it at some point. I need to get more into meditation again, and do some of these things. I got scared off from it a long time ago when I was practicing these rituals and things like that much more sort of systematically and repetitively. And once these presences or these various dreams, sleep paralysis type stuff, like I was talking with you last time, Pennyavasa, about the alien abduction type experiences and these sorts of things, once they became very strong, it caused me to back off. I was becoming very addicted at various times to opiates and things like that. And these are all things which can happen to a person when their mental integrity becomes very weak when they're doing these practices. There's a tendency for the persona to just fall apart, degrade, and at that point one is just pretty much becoming psychically infected. This is the term that Jung would use, psychically infected. And so I had to step back from that and just try to ground myself, and I tried to shut that part of my life out completely and just go back to a mundane existence as much as I could, because it was quite terrifying. But I think I'm ready to try and open it back up again a little bit. I just have to kind of start with the basics again.
You just live a clean and moral life so that you don't have any soft, rotten spots that are easily infected.
That's right, and I do the best I can. When I was in Florida, I was following the precepts without even knowing it. Sleeping on the floor, doing everything, no caffeine, even no nothing. So and at that point, I was able to make some contact, I guess, with some of these things. Not always in a positive way, but it kind of opens you up, I think, a little bit more when you're living that life. But like you said, it also makes you solid all the way around. Once you get any little hole in there in the aura, then it just invites trouble. It's one reason why I was saying earlier I'll do decaf tea instead of regular tea. I did regular tea this time, but even just that caffeine, any kind of psychotropic drug, I believe causes some type of energy loss or some type of rupture in the spiritual body, auric body, whatever you want to call it, in my experience.
Yeah, with regard to proving anything, I'm of the opinion that, especially considering the worldview that we've established, like the rules and laws that kind of stabilize our little world, that the gods are essentially paranormal. That there's no way you're going to objectively prove them. They're out on the fringe necessarily. They're not following laws of physics that some European physicist discovered 200 years ago, anything like that. That it's necessarily going to be kind of a trickster element or sort of a chaotic bleed through into this world. I mean, maybe there are beings that are more advanced than us, out beyond our little world that we've created for ourselves. But I mean, they're going to be paranormal from our point of view, from the Western cultural point of view.
The most objective possible way a god manifests is through omens and through synchronicity. So yeah, they're not going to be things that some materialist with a bunch of measuring tools is going to be able to prove, and it's pointless anyway. And I never have any interest in trying to prove my beliefs to a materialist.
Yeah, it'd be like the Ghost Chaser shows where they've got all the weird.
Yeah, it's so
Well,
and then you never find one.
To myself though, and that's my ultimate goal. Right, that's been my ultimate goal in all of this since the time that I was pretty young, was to prove it to myself. To get to the point where I feel okay. There's absolutely no doubt in my own mind, at least, from the experiences that I've had. That was kind of the feeling that I had after one of those experiences that I described in the last video, where I woke up and I said, wow, my life will never be the same again. This is that was it. But over time, over the years, those kind of experiences, it's like a trauma experience. One has a tendency to kind of shut it off from the rest of one's life. So one goes about one's mundane existence, and then one says, was that really real? And one starts to kind of begin to doubt it. But as traumatic as it would be, I would like to eventually have another one of those experiences that would remove any doubt from my mind, and to get to a point where I could actually have those experiences on command, to where I could communicate more freely and openly with it, while still being able to control it, without going nuts. And I think that's sort of the ultimate goal of anybody who's involved in this sort of thing, I guess. At least if you're doing it maybe for the right reasons, and the wrong reasons probably are just, so you can put a curse on somebody and kill them or whatever. I mean, we all have those kind of mundane reasons as well, but I think the ultimate reason is for something a little bit more spiritual. But it's good to balance the two out.
Yeah, well, we've been going at it for more than an hour and a half now, it seems, and so I think possibly we should come to conclusions.
Sure.
My conclusion is that I'm assuming that we exist, then I have no doubt that beings more advanced than us exist, some of whom may take an interest in us, most of them don't. But from the Buddhist point of view, especially sort of a Mahayanist metaphysic that I favor, that ultimate just the plenum exists, or it even just goes beyond the duality of existence and non-existence. Like Hegel was saying at the beginning, pure being and pure non-being, they just merge together. They can't be differentiated. That's why maybe one reason why physicists now are saying empty space contains zero energy and infinite energy at the same time, in a way. So ultimately, it's all an illusion to some degree, although still there are structures and rules or logical necessities and so forth that all contribute, in addition to culture and just human psychology, that contribute to form this stable, more or less predictable world that we live in. And although it's not ultimately real, it's virtually real, which is real enough for us. And so I have no problem at all with the idea that there are superhuman beings inhabiting this cosmos, even though they may never be proven to exist. It may be that humanity won't start believing in them again, which probably is of little concern to most of them. But ultimately, I mean, you've got the capital G God, or the Absolute, or the Tao, or Brahman, or whatever you want to call that, or the good, as Plotinus. I think that's what Plotinus called the ultimate, or the absolute.
Yeah, it started with Plato, that term, but yeah, he expanded upon it.
Yeah. So I've got no problem with it, and yeah, I send metta to them.
Me too.
Well, I'm entirely on board with that message.
Yes. Well, here, you first. You make your concluding statement if you have one, and then I will follow you.
I guess my only concluding statement is, one's life is going to be much more happy and fulfilling if you recognize the numinous in everything, and that there's this massive, just unfathomable spiritual reality out there, and this little meat space is just a little teeny piece of it, and focusing only on that, you're going to be not so happy.
To dovetail off that, I've heard that shamans in indigenous societies, when they're confronted with the ways that Western Europeans have treated mental illness, or what they call spiritual possession, they're shocked, because the way that we have traditionally done it is to say that the illness is a part of you, that it is created by some sort of character flaw in the human being, and the way that we deal with that is by sequestering the person away from society in a room somewhere, and then we feed them these things, and they continue generally to get worse and worse, pills and whatever else, shock treatment. Because to the shaman, what he does is basically, or to what the indigenous societies generally do in this kind of situation, is they tell the person this is actually an external attack, so they externalize what it is, and they treat it by integrating the person actually into the tribe even further, right? So it's a completely different kind of mentality.
I think they have a much healthier understanding of the human psyche. My second concluding remark is that modern psychologists and psychiatrists, they don't know their ass from a hole in the ground when it actually comes to the human psyche, or the human soul, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, psychologists were saying throughout most of the 20th century that, I mean, we were just devoid of animal instincts.
It's just materialism.
Yeah.
I think there are even some psychologists now that are starting to recognize that there is the potential for interaction with these spirits. I mean, one of my concluding statements would be to say that I do believe, regardless of if these things are sentient in the way that you and I might be, they do exist in some way, and they are having a consistent effect on many of us in our daily actions and our daily lives, particularly now through technology, which is a new way that these spirits are able to manifest themselves in our own life and to affect us without us even knowing it. And I think we are particularly predisposed to these ill-natured spiritual influences now, particularly because of our ignorance about them, because of our belief systems, because of our materialism and our reliance, our dependency on technology, which has become parasitic, where the technology begins to take on a mind of its own. It has its own spirit and its own spiritual effects. It's something that needs to be moderated in our lives, along with the rest of the addictions and the vices that we have, because it predisposes us to be a great spiritual peril. And the fact that we mock it and laugh at it and can't realize it, can't recognize that, only imperils us even worse.
Yeah, I agree that if there are superhuman beings, it's a good idea to not piss them off and try to be on good terms with them. Like in Buddhism, pretty much the only thing one does with regard to gods is send metta. Just offer up your respect and your friendly intentions and leave it at that. Which does remind me of like sacrifice. I mean, that's like a common aspect of polytheistic paganism, is the fire sacrifice or whatever. And I think a lot of that is just sort of a cosmic balance. You're sacrificing something of value to you in order to create a kind of deficit that's going to come back the other way, just through karma or cosmic balance or whatever.
Mhm.
Although I would say that if the gods have any response to a human making some sort of devout sacrifice, it would be sort of like the response of a cat that loves you offers you a dead lizard that it just caught, and that you don't have any need for the dead lizard, but still the cat has just demonstrated that it loves you, and it causes you to love the cat more.
Yeah, these are hermetic laws that people are largely unaware of, and so they've ignored this aspect of sacrifice in their life in favor of accumulating more and more and more, not understanding that that's not generally the way that it works. One has to be sort of a conduit or a channel for energy. If one is just an accumulation, then one is a black hole, right? Or one will eventually just explode. There has to be an equal in and out in everything. And that's one of the things that we've definitely forgotten. And that also puts us in great danger, I think. But that's about it. I mean, that's, for me, I think I've said my piece.
Yeah.
Aside from saying it was a great honor to meet you and to speak with you, Numa, and
likewise,
of course, Panyabasa as well. It's been one of the great honors of my life to be able to meet you both and talk with you. So sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you.
And may all beings be happy, including the gods.